the Ireland Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce Hotels event.
On behalf of the Ireland Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce, I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening on where we will discuss effectively the impact of COVID-19 on the hotel industry and some of the factors that play into that. Our speaker this evening is Gregory Turngahat, and Gregory is going to talk to us not just about the hotel industry, but as I said, the factors that play into the impacts on that. Gregory's got a long background in the industry in the Far East, the Middle East, Europe, and now runs I hope I get the pronunciation of this, Regiotel, which is a management operation for small independent hotels. Just based on a very brief conversation with Gregory this afternoon, he raised a whole bunch of interesting issues. In terms of the logistics, you can post questions on the chat function, but I will try to manage as we move forward if people want to unmute people when they want to ask a question. So without saying very much more, I'm going to hand over to Gregory. And Gregory, I'm going to organize so that you can share screen. Okay, that should be okay for you
now. Excellent. Can everyone see my screen or? No, 1 second. There we go, that should do it. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here, speaking about how COVID has affected my industry. For those that know me, it's been a period of great upheaval in my industry, but also an interesting time for facial appendages. So there we go. And it's very much not over yet. In fact, as the dust settles, we're now starting to see what happens in the industry for smaller and larger players. I was asked to speak about the impacts of COVID and some ideas to the future as to what's going to happen in the travel industry. And I was chosen based on my experience of working with hospitality, both large and small, for Accor for 10, 15 years and across the globe in Cambodia, Poland, Brussels, Dubai, London, Paris, and finally Luxembourg, where I settled 6 years ago. And for the last 3 years, I have had a company called Regiotels that helps regional hotels, independent hotels indeed. And our goal is to effectively digitize them and prepare them for the future, and not every hotel is as easy to book as an Accor or Marriott, and our goal is to ensure that those independent hotels, small, medium enterprises, have the same advantages or same capabilities as some of the larger groups. So without further ado, I was given a brief. I'll share the presentation afterwards, but I wanted to start with a little bit about what happens in an average hotel and the process by which it acquires its business. So obviously the goal of a hotel is to attract as many clients as possible at the optimal rate. And if you forget the notion of a hotel and think of an aeroplane, the aeroplane is impossible to sell. It's impossible to sell seats on an aeroplane once the plane's taken off. Well, once the clock has struck midnight, it's impossible to sell the room, and that inventory goes to the next day. So you're dealing with a very sensitive inventory management. And for the most part, the goal is to open up availability a year in advance, possibly even more, depending on the market. So for example, in a place like Singapore or Shanghai or indeed any of these other large Asian cities where there are global trade fairs organized many years in advance, the hotel knows already that there will be demand in such and such a year at such and such a time. And therefore they open up availability and price accordingly. But I'm going to speak mostly about the kind of hotels that I've been working with in Europe. And they follow a very traditional cycle. So obviously with the 12 months, it's very much a case of year in, year out, similar sorts of things. So January to April is typically the time for leisure contracting. And so what will happen is a hotel of any standing, as we're in Luxembourg, I'll pick the Novotel Kirchberg. It's a large hotel, 280 odd rooms. They're going to look to fill their leisure segment around a year to 500 days in advance. So in March of 2020, they should have known, well, okay, let's say March of 2021, they will know that in January of 2022, certain groups will start arriving. And that is absolutely crucial because that can't take place right now. So all of the leisure contracting that was due to go on between January, February, March, and April has not taken place in 2020. The result is, of course, there isn't a single leisure contract for any hotel for 2021. So that's an entire segment that has gone. And when you think of leisure travel, you're thinking of your holidays, you're thinking of all sorts of things, but it's not only personal, there are all the businesses behind. And we saw what happened to Thomas Cook in September of 2019. So that is the first impact. The other element is the rest of the year, which is the corporate segment, which is September, October, November, December. And so it's effectively a tale of thirds. The year is broken out into thirds, with the summer months being when there's high season. The last third for the corporate segment is based on forecast business travel. And that is, again, very much planned in advance through a process called RFP season, request for proposals. That's what RFP means. And large companies such as Amazon or ArcelorMittal will send out to the various hotels around the world their list of requirements. So for example, I don't know, Luxembourg, I think, had a request from Amazon for something like 15,000 room nights, which is quite excessive. But that was due to trainings and various other things going on in the Luxembourg marketplace. And all the hotels will try and pitch in for as much of that business as they can. And obviously with a hotel that's got 280 rooms, they're not going to utilize their full capacity to take this Amazon business or whomever else. They will try and split up their inventory so that they're taking as much pre-planned business to have a base rate and as much last-minute business, which they can increase their rates with and therefore have a good average rate over the year. So what we're really talking about is a traditional booking cycle that existed pre-March 2020 doesn't really exist anymore. And it's anyone's guess as to what the consequences are going to be. But I'm going to go into a little more detail as to how those areas are impacted. And I wanted to start with tour operators. So this is getting back to the leisure segment. Now, tour operators and wholesalers, it's highly probable that you haven't actually come across many of those. Wholesalers especially, because they don't sell to individuals. They collectively buy up large inventory and then sell it to travel agencies. But some of the tour operators you will have heard of, so TUI and Thomas Cook, those were the biggest, but there are a great many others, are very much struggling at the moment. And the reason they're struggling is because their business model depends on Mr. and Mrs. Smith going to a shop on the high street of their local town and planning up to 9, 10, 12 months ahead, a holiday in wherever it might be, Tenerife or Spain or Morocco. And everybody has now seen exactly how that business model works. It works on a constant renewal of cash flow. And so when there is a crisis, such as COVID in March of this year, it is nigh on impossible for the money to be returned because it's already been spent. And so there are still people trying to wait for their refunds, in October of 2020 from holidays that were booked that were supposed to take place in March, according to the BBC. So it's not a very a refund-friendly business, and it's absolutely dependent on a constant renewal and a constant demand. They have everything in place to ease the process of travel in a difficult to visit destination. So if you think of somewhere like Egypt, well, there's the flight to consider, then there's the fact that language might be a concern, then there's the general getting around, trusting of food. So what these companies do, these TUIs and Thomas Cook's, is they provide the airplane, they provide the staff, they provide the transfer from the airport to the hotel, and it's a real sort of mollycoddling holiday where you're enclosed in a group and everything is taken care of. In fact, there's very little reason to leave the hotel, and it's very much all pre-planned, and it's a tried and tested method. Wholesalers are slightly different in that they are buying up hotel inventory and selling it to travel agencies who then create their own plans and their own tours. And the thing about these two is that no wholesaler, to the best of my knowledge, has had much success in getting hold of any room inventory for next year because the hotels don't quite know how to price it. And then, of course, there's a communication element. If everybody's on a furlough, then that doesn't aid the process. And the tour operators have had troubles getting any clarity on the situation. And obviously, they're also having a terrible time trying to figure out which market is open for how long and when they can get their planes to and from. So you've got an entire segment of the travel industry that is unable to function as I speak. And that's obviously going to have terrible detrimental effects, but we have no idea what those effects will be. What I can say is that when Thomas Cook went bankrupt in September of 2019, there were tens of thousands of individual hotels that lost money. There were tens of hundreds that went bankrupt as a result. There were close to 23,000 individuals who lost their jobs. And that was just one company. And this is all of them that are concerned. So it's too early to say. The other difference with Thomas Cook, of course, is that they went bankrupt in September, which is at the end of the high season, and therefore they hadn't paid any of their bills because their model is to pay at the end of the season. So they hadn't paid any of their bills, whereas this year, if a company goes under, even in the future, it's not like they'll be owing money to the hotel businesses because there hasn't been much tourism at all. So generally speaking, there is a large question over the existence and survival of these larger entities such as TUI and wholesalers. But it's not just leisure travel that's important. If we look at corporate travel, that also has taken a hit. And when you look at the spend of corporate travel in the EU, I didn't really have the figures for leisure to hand, but I was able to find some for corporate travel. And you'll see that there's quite a significant sum of money that is not coming into the European economy this year. It's anyone's guess as to when that may start up again. But it's fair to say that very little happened on the continent between mid-March and the end of May. And everything opening up thereafter was pretty quiet. So if we find that even a fraction of this, 10% of this 1.15 trillion euro cake is recovered, I'd be very happily surprised. Corporate travel is the mainstay of the hospitality industry, especially for the larger companies such as Accor and Marriott and Intercom. And it's their bread and butter. The gap filler is the tourism business, but the raison d'etre, as it were, is the corporate travel. And that is certainly going to be felt long after COVID, as a great many of you have no doubt experienced. Working from home is not actually that difficult, and affords one quite a few additional perks and bonuses and benefits. Obviously, as an employer, I rather resent the clouding of home life, office life, but some people love that. So it means that some people end up working terrible hours, and others, well, doing whatever they need to. But the long and short of it is that home office is quite clearly here to stay, and that's going to have an impact on these figures, certainly for the future. And the global growth that was planned in 2019 was that it would only increase, by quite a significant number, which is now never going to happen. So 1.7 trillion was forecast by 2022, from the 2017 spend of 1.15. Who's to say when that will return? I think we've got an elephant in the room, which is that it's not just a question of corporate travel, but there's also the element of how many jobs are going to survive the end of furlough, and what is that going to mean to the typical white-collar jobs that supported this global travel. There are very few industries that aren't deeply affected by COVID, and it's anyone's guess as to what's going to happen over the next 3 to 6 months with the end of furlough. But people are talking about 11% unemployment in the UK, and that's just scratching the surface. So we'll soon see about that. Moving into what brings people to hotels, you've got to think about travel. And when we think about where people come from for Europe, I thought it would be interesting to have a look at just the Boeing 747. If we take that as an example of life before COVID and life after, you're all no doubt aware the 747 has effectively been mothballed 3 or 4 years early for British Airways. I don't know how many years early for Lufthansa, but certainly several. And it's looking increasingly unlikely that there will be another 747 with humans passengers as opposed to cargo passengers. Obviously, Cargo Lux is going to still fly their 747s over our houses and make their presence felt in Luxembourg. But for the most part, if you look, these are the airports that had a daily flight into Europe every day of the year from 2019. And some of those airports, when you take sort of New York JFK, would have had, goodness knows, 7, 8, 9 daily flights. I mean, they certainly had 4 or 5 daily full 747s into London from JFK. So these are big numbers of flights. And when you start looking at what a 747 is, well, they called it the Queen of the Skies, but it was an airplane that could take 416 passengers. And that is a lot of people in one place at one time, moving quickly. And when you think of the challenges facing one of the biggest stories in airport or aviation history in the UK is the third runway at Heathrow. That's a story that comes up pretty much annually. And when you look at what the issue is, an airplane can only land and take off within a certain time period. It can only be met at the gate at a certain time period, and that cannot be extended without more runways. So there are only so many airplanes that can land on a runway at any given day. Now, nobody is suggesting that the timing will either be increased or decreased. So you're talking about the same landing slot that used to be occupied by a 747, but in future, as of post-COVID times, it will be an airplane that has a capacity of 280 people. So a 40% reduction, landing at the same time. So in fact, the only change is that you've got smaller planes with fewer people. And that's before we start talking about the loss of the A380. That's before we start talking about the future of airlines generally, because I don't know that there's a single airline on the planet that hasn't received a vast bailout from governments in the last few months. And so, in fact, the entire industry is in a state of flux. Will there be enough survivors in the airline industry? Maybe there's going to be a large amount of consolidation, but that remains to be seen. Are there going to be survivors in the industry? And of those survivors, will they be able to ramp up flights and negotiate the time slots of the vacated space before the actual airport goes under? So if you look at EasyJet, EasyJet have just pulled out of Newcastle. Golly, my memory, I'm afraid I can't remember for the life of me, but there are a number of stories on BBC about EasyJet, and they pulled out, I think, of 3 or 4 airports in the UK, and they were the mainstay of those airports. So then the question is, how long does that airport survive if it doesn't have any planes and people coming through? And how will it be replaced? And this is where we get to the hotels, because of course, around every airport, there are a number of businesses that have the knock-on supply chain effect, and hotels are one of them. So regional hospitality is threatened by the lack of 747s and the lack of local and regional air travel, because of course, you can't get the passengers to filter through. A 747 flying from New York to London may have 416 passengers. How many or what percentage of them would come through to Luxembourg on any given day? I don't know the numbers, and there isn't really tracking, but there must be some. And of those, how do they filter through into the wider hotel environment? Well, who's to say, but it was certainly very, there isn't tracking on this kind of thing, or at least not that's publicly available to me. But the concept remains, or the logic remains, that if there are fewer people on the main route, then there are going to be even fewer people on the sub-routes. And if we look at Ryanair, just to see where there are published stats, just for the month of September 2020, they carried 5.1 million passengers, which to me sounds jolly impressive. But when you compare it to September 2019, that's 30% of what they were capable of doing last year. And if that is, I believe, the world's most frequent flyer, or the world's largest number of flights, can't remember their tagline, but they're one of the larger carriers in the world. And if they're suffering in quite a way as they are, then what does that say for the rest of us? So during COVID, we had a number of things happen in tourism generally. It was the first year without Thomas Cook. We started to see the risks of going on a cruise holiday. And I'd say it's a brave person that wants to book a cruise holiday after COVID. We saw TUI go up against the wall, and they're still not totally out of the woods. We saw air traffic decrease. So generally speaking, the impact was swift and brutal to the tourism industry. Of course, throughout this time, it didn't need writing, but every hotel effectively seized up in terms of occupancy. The only beneficiaries were hotels that were located next to a hospital, who were able to then take on additional staff, because of course the poor hospital staff were working such chaotic and horrendous hours, but also had to go into isolation vis-a-vis their own families, that in fact a great many hotels had their biggest turnover on account of, well, effectively government subsidized nursing and doctors sleeping close to where they were working. But for the most part, it was near catastrophe. The governments were rather slow to act. The Luxembourgers were in fact frightfully fast. My experience is based on having clients in Belgium, Germany and Luxembourg, and having a company in Germany and having a company in, two companies in Luxembourg. And so I was able to see both on the side of the clients, but also as a business in that specific industry, because I have a NACE code or an industry code that says I am a hotel for one reason or another, even though I'm an agency that supports hotels. And so I was treated as a hotel by the Luxembourg government, and I was treated as a hotel by the German government. And in Germany, I have a GmbH, so it's the sort of the bigger of the smaller businesses. And without mudslinging, it's just a simple fact to say that given the choice, I would never want to be anywhere other than Luxembourg throughout a crisis, certainly if ever there is another one. And it was quite stark, the difference between the reaction on the part of the Belgian state and the Luxembourg state. And then again, it was different between the German state and the Luxembourg state, but I'll come to that later. Ultimately, though, the impact was swift, and it was fairly brutal for hospitality. And within you know, a good month or so, certainly towards the end of March, towards the middle of April, news started coming out about corporate plans and various ideas for moving forward. One of the initial ones was, of course, corporate travel halting, which I've covered earlier. But you know, for Amazon, that manifested itself in a total seizing or halting of global travel up until the end of the year, and then it was extended, I believe, until June. And that has a major impact on a country such as Luxembourg, when you consider that Amazon was responsible, I think, for something like 17% of every seat sold on Luxair. So that's you know, that's quite a bit. And if they're not going to be traveling at all, well, that would explain why Luxair have recently just let go of 600 of their staff. When you look at the impact of the cross-border barriers, that is an ongoing problem. So, for example, I was in a conversation only several days ago with a Belgian who was telling me that he'd had this plan to go to Mullertal in Luxembourg for a lovely weekend. And all of a sudden, the Belgians had put the Grand Duchy in a red zone, in spite of the fact that that day, Belgium had had more cases per 100,000 than Luxembourg. But anyway, and the result of there being a red zone in Luxembourg meant that the individual would have had to quarantine or self-isolate upon returning, and so he chose to cancel that booking and stay in Belgium. Well, hooray for national tourism, but that's not really what the Schengen project is all about. And so that's certainly having its impact, and that's still going on today, with pockets coming out red all over the European map at the moment. Large hotel chains are also absolutely on their knees. I mean, if you look at the occupancy of the Accor chain in Luxembourg, I believe it's somewhere between 10 and 12%. And that's not a sustainable number, which would explain why some of these larger groups, from Hilton to Marriott, are announcing so many of their workforce being culled. I'm hearing numbers of between 20 and 30%. And they're not actually talking about the individual at the reception desk, because some elements of hospitality can't really be automated. They're, for the most part, speaking about the people that do the job that, in fact, RegioTels tries to provide to its customers. So should RegioTels grow, then I'll know where to find staff. But the fact is that a great many of the teams of larger hotels are made up in the back office areas, involved in what's called sales, marketing, distribution, revenue management. So the people that analyze the pricing, the people that put the hotel or brand the hotel in areas that you will find it, so various websites and so forth. And also the obviously the auxiliary staff, like the housekeepers. Well, if you've got no guests sleeping in the beds, then you don't need so many people changing bedrooms. So there are huge impacts, and all of this is going to have huge social upheaval, because these are all entry-level jobs. In fact, the most affected industry is not quite the right word. The most affected people by COVID, to my mind, are those in the service, hospitality, and sort of people-to-people industries. And invariably, those are ones where one doesn't really need academic qualifications. You physically need to be there, so you can't actually work from home. If you're not at the bar and you're the barman, then there is no work, and presumably there's also no pay. And that is very much the case in Europe, but across other countries. I mean, it's just inevitable that should this continue, social unrest will also come with it, because there are just too many people who are unable to tap into funds and support. With regards to hospitality generally, it is certainly at a crossroads, because there are a great many people being laid off. And so the question is, how does one build up a recovery if one doesn't have the manpower? And some of the more recent stories, for example, the 2nd of October, the UK government announced that up to 90,000 events jobs would go. Well, when you think of what those jobs relate to and what they refer to, they're, for those of us that used to go to London some years ago, it was Earl's Court, but now it's all Excel in the Docklands. These vast areas that have global events, bringing in all sorts of people, from surgeons to technology conferences to goodness knows what else. Those large event centers are real hubs of activity for both hotels, because of course they bring in new people from outside, but also they have so many spillover jobs, and they have such an important role to play in the supply chain. So that's something to look at, and all of that was affected during COVID. Now, what I've been focused on more recently is regional hospitality. And so I thought I'd have a look at that, just to show you some of the impacts that I've noticed just in the portfolio of RegioTels clients. And there it's already quite stark. The Belgians are very much behind, 34% behind, in fact. Luxembourg is 26% behind, and Germany is 7% behind. And I can't really quite tell you. I mean, one can draw their own conclusions as to why. Is it adhesion to the rules and regulations about isolation and quarantine and lack of social interaction? Is it to do with government support? I mean, for example, the Luxembourg government gave vouchers to everybody living, I believe, in Luxembourg and also working in Luxembourg. I hope you've had a chance to use yours, of 50 euros per person. And that's had an absolutely fantastic effect on national tourism. But once that initiative dies down, which I believe it pretty much has now from its peak, you know, who's to say where the hotels are going to end up versus either last year or generally. It's a very sobering fact when you include the notion that the majority of these hoteliers are certainly 60 plus. It was a challenge already a year or two ago to convince their children to not go and work for, this is for Luxembourg, to not go and work for the local commune as a fonctionnaire, to not go and work in finance, and to stay in the family business and take over as the fourth generation hotelier. Well, if it was tough then, it's only going to be harder now. And that story is symptomatic of pretty much every country in Europe. Most people do not, once they've won the lottery or inherited a fortune, decide to go and buy a regional hotel. Invariably, they will inherit it from their parents or grandparents, and they'll take over the challenge of trying to avoid looking like Basil Fawlty. And the challenges that were present before COVID are only going to be worse after, given that it's not just the hospitality sector that's been affected, but every single other one. And so just getting things back to normal for those hotels in regional areas is going to be a challenge. Staffing, for one. When people can't find work in the area and they can't afford food and need help, they invariably move. So there'll be a pool of people that are effectively just moving, and we're seeing that already. One of the more common conversations that the hotels that we work with in Luxembourg are asking my colleagues for is help for recruitment, finding chefs and waiters. A small hotel with 14 rooms in Echternach needs to find waiters if it wants to open for dinner service tonight. And if there are no waiters presenting themselves, then they can't open for dinner, and therefore that whole evening's service is gone and the food gets wasted, and it's a vicious circle that only escalates. But ultimately, the difference can be looked at in a number of ways. I also have a theory that the Germans are very strong on national tourism, and perhaps the Luxembourgers are not so much. I'm not able to speculate as to why there is such a difference. Only that I've noticed that this is happening in Europe in a way that is certainly very different to other parts of the world. In the most part, if you look at South America, it's the entire market. If you look at Southeast Asia, it's all hotels. It's not one area or one segment that benefits and the others don't. Now, when you look at COVID's impact on life after this whole sort of pandemic is over, and goodness knows when that will be, but there's a hope and a thought process that in fact it's going to be better in the spring. I don't know if that's just wonderful optimism or genuine foretelling, but anyway, the global air traffic is not expected to return in any way, shape or form to what it was for a number of years. And even those numbers, I believe, are terribly optimistic. I can't understand how they can. If you can't increase the capacity of aeroplanes landing at Heathrow or Charles de Gaulle, and they're carrying fewer passengers than before. But, you know, I'm not the one coming up with these stats. So that's what's being reported up until 2024. It's anticipated that there won't be a return to normalcy, but thereafter, who knows? I believe that the shift in home working has made a huge transformation for corporate travel and corporate hotels, and I'd say it's a brave person that buys shares in a major hotel company these days, especially given that I mean, the way the share prices have been going for companies like Marriott and Accor over the years is more akin to increasing their revenues by buying up other companies than in fact getting more revenue out of the individual locations. That's just the way the market's been working, but consolidation has certainly been a thing, and I wonder if that's going to continue. When I was working at Accor, I believe they had 8 7 or 8 brands, and I think they're into their 40s now. And I left in 2017. So there you go. That's a lot of consolidation in very few years. The tour operators are certainly having a terrible time. A great many of the bus companies have gone bankrupt already in Germany. That's a big thing because a bus has a capacity of 64 people, and there are lots of them generally. No bus company just has one bus. So that's already a means of transporting people from A to B, which are no longer going to be able to go to these hotels. They were predominantly going to hotels like, using Luxembourg as an example, the Novotel Kirchberg and the Park Elvis, simply because they were large parking areas. I'm not quite sure where they're going to be going now, but that's, yeah, that's certainly going to have an impact. And some of these larger bus companies, Eurolines is a familiar logo. You may not know the name, but you'll know the logo from your driving on most European roads. And the loss will be felt over the next few years and further. I don't think I took a coach journey since I was 15, but that's not the point. There are a great many people who do. And for the most part, they stay in regional hotels. So that's going to have a huge impact. Ultimately, though, one of the challenges is what to do with all these assets. You know, a large 200-300 room hotel is, it's a big thing. And there's only so many uses you can have for something that was purpose built as a hotel, which is effectively modular and very small. The average size, you know, a decent sized room in a hotel can be between 23 and 27 meters squared. And you can only get so much out of knocking down walls, and the depth is never going to change. So you can knock a whole load of rooms together, but it still won't make for a very hospitable living space on a grander scale. I'm sure there are some apartments, certainly in Luxembourg, that feel smaller, but generally speaking, it's challenging to repurpose a hotel, and Frankfurt is going to have to go over that because they've already closed or announced the closure of, I think, 12 large corporate hotels located around Metz, the events conference hall, funnily enough. So that's certainly something that is going to have a spillover effect, because it's a vicious circle. With the lack of corporate travel, with the lack of events, with the lack of leisure tourism, the hotels are going to close. As more close, there's this sort of downward spiral of limited availability. So why bother traveling? Why not have it online, like this conference, which normally traditionally would be held in a hotel, if I'm mistaken, unless I'm much mistaken. So there are a number of questions that are arising as to what's going to happen to these buildings, which in some cases stand out like huge entities that can't really have anything else going for them. I'm thinking of Barcelona, where you just see the hotels that are so distinct in the skyline compared to everything else, and don't have a hope in hell of filling their 400 or 500 room capacity, certainly for the next few years. That brings us to the future of travel booking. And I mean, there's a certain fact that's taken place throughout this COVID pandemic, and that is that anybody that thought they were not too savvy on the internet has had a certain readjustment. I mean, the number of grandmothers that have become TikTok experts and WhatsApp pioneers and goodness knows what else. I mean, everyone's effectively becoming internet savvy. And you've got to wonder what kind of person would go into a travel agent and not do the research themselves. What kind of person does go to these tour operators anymore when they've just had a crash course online and they understand the concept of search and offsetting pros and cons themselves, and they've got the time and taking the time to do all that. So I think that there's going to be a lot of an impact, because well, most of the travel is booked by handheld devices today. And most people are fairly comfortable using those devices. So effectively, any hotel that hasn't figured that out and is behind the curve, first of all, they need to get in touch with me. But second of all, ultimately, they're going to fall by the wayside. So any problems that they had in 2020 are only going to be exacerbated in 2021 and beyond. And so it's a concern, because of course, when you take away, I mean, a regional hotel isn't the first thing you think of, but when you take away a regional hotel, think of the impact it has on the local community. You've got the loss of jobs, but also the people that were staying in that hotel were spending money in the local commerce. They were going to visit the local museums. I'm not saying it's the most important building in the village. Don't want to compete with the church now, but it's very much, it's a tough thing to imagine a town without hotels, because you're effectively only dependent on the people living there. And take away all the hotels from Paris, and would it be the most visited city on the planet? Possibly not. So we've got elements with regards to the digitalization, but then there's also the fact of how's it going to work with staffing? How are hotels going to be able to offset the balance between taking a risk on hiring an employee and not being certain of the usage of that employee? For example, a shift in a hotel is an 8-hour shift. It used to be with a break. Now it's got to be a straight shift. Now, if you have a restaurant in your hotel, and or even a receptionist, if you've got a receptionist, people are not coming for 8 hours of the day. They are coming very intensively between 7 and 9 in a corporate hotel, and they are leaving. They're leaving between 7 and 9, and you could argue up until 12, but most corporate hotels have finished the majority of their checkouts by 9 a.m. And they are arriving in the hotel technically from 2 p.m., but the reality is it's normally after the business day. So there are two large waves, 5 to 7 p.m. or 7 to 9 a.m. And you don't really have that much use for the person on all the other times. So there's an element of, I wouldn't call it charity, but one has to find other repurposing for these individuals. Well, now imagine that you don't have those rushes. You don't have that large flux of people coming for lunch anymore. The business lunches are not necessarily taking place in person. They're taking place online. All of this is going to have a detrimental effect on recruitment. And it will no doubt be a consideration of people as to whether they should actually recruit at all, or whether they should just forego the business because the risk is too great. If you engage someone on a CDI contract in Luxembourg, you're making a commitment to them, and it's difficult to change that commitment. And it might just be easier just to, well, frankly, close the restaurant. And so that is exactly what we're seeing across a number of hotels that I'm familiar with. And who's to say where that's going to go? And when you start looking at the trends for the future, I mean, it's anyone's guess. Will corporate travel recover? I mean, the fact is that there's a whole movement of ecologically minded millennials who are going out on the streets every Friday to campaign about a better ecology for the future. Presumably part of that is limiting air travel. And maybe this is the time to make that change so that tourism becomes a little bit greener. Maybe it should become something more akin to what it was like when we were all younger. I'm using the collective, but tourism in the 70s and 80s was pretty national in a personal capacity. I remember going to British beaches with all their stones and broken glass. It was a delight. Maybe that's going to be the norm. It's also going to be perhaps more independent, more experiential, less down the beaten track, less tour operator based, perhaps. I would have thought that regional tourism is certainly going to maintain its position as a versatile option because it's so unique. to so many who have been used to jetting off to Morocco for the week or the weekend, and it's possibly going to have all manner of different impacts. But I realize now, sorry, that I've been a bit wax lyrical and that I've talked for way beyond the time I was given. So perhaps I should open up for questions, should there be any, and hope that there are still people that have stayed behind. So thank you for listening, and sorry for going overboard. And I'm all ears.
Listen, Gregory, that was really excellent. And I see we have in fact retained all of our participants throughout the entire discussion. I think it was very interesting. If somebody has a question, if they want to type it into the chat function, I will happily pass it on. While we're waiting for that, Gregory, how do you feel about companies like Expedia, Booking.com? I mean, I was recently told that Expedia was sort of prior to COVID, that it was basically junk status. It's as an investment and the cash flow had major issues there. Did you hear anything about that and how they're doing?
I haven't. I'll do a little plug and just say that yesterday I was at the European Tourism Day. That was my first Zoom conference, and there were only 4 private companies in this rather large forum. Regio Hotels was one, Booking, Airbnb, and Expedia were the others. And I suppose we were all sharing positive, slightly more positive than this perhaps, but positive, upbeat messages about the future. And I see no reason to believe why Expedia would not be a viable model. I mean, they have multiple brands that you may or may not have heard of. Hotels.com is another one. None of these companies are alone. Booking.com isn't an island. It's part of Priceline, and it's got a whole swathe of, I think Agoda is part of them, really major travel websites. So they're never just the one that you've heard of. It's a whole family of others. Expedia has Agencia, which is a major corporate travel booker. That may be under threat, very possible. But I don't know that Expedia generally. It's a big beast. But I wouldn't know per se. All I can say is that the hotelier's perspective of these companies is that you're sort of dancing with the devil. But it's because they've I suppose they haven't really gone far enough to explain what they do for the hotels. The simple fact of the matter is that Booking.com is either the number 1 or the number 2 spender on Google in terms of advertising. So you've got the largest company, the largest expenditure of advertising on the biggest platform that's used by the most people is by a hotel booking company. If you're a little hotel in the middle of nowhere, how are you going to find your guests? Well, Booking.com is the answer. So, people don't like the idea of these companies because they take whatever it is, 15%. But TUI and Thomas Cook used to take 25. So it's easier working with a Booking than with a TUI. Of course, with a TUI, you understand that they're renting shops and paying more people and so on and so forth. And I presume the notion is that Booking.com is taking more of the profit out of an entity that has to pay the rent and the salaries. But ultimately, I think that hospitality can't live without these companies, and they're absolutely vital to the survival of rural, smaller entities. Otherwise, how would you and I find them? Unless we're prepared to really do the research. And my goodness, sometimes you have to really do the research.
Yes, I mean, I think it's an interesting point. I'm looking to see if we have any questions. Yes. From Alan. Let me just now they're starting to come. From Alan, do you think regional hotels will need to change their business model and expand their offer to survive? Will it be that only the larger regional hotels will survive, as they would be the only ones that can invest?
So, well, it depends what kind of size we're talking about regional hotels. For the majority of the portfolio in Regio Hotels, we're talking 27 rooms, and the owners actually live in the building. So once you've got your mortgage paid off, you can turn off the heating if you don't want to heat up that wing, and you can cut costs and you can let go of staff. So presumably there is a way to offset some of the risks. And then, of course, you've got government handouts that'll keep you going. So I think for the smaller hotels, there's not so much risk, and it's not going to be absolutely awful. In fact, I've got 31 hotels in my portfolio, and 7 of them have so far year to date made more money than last year. And they were closed half of March, April, and May. So, go figure. There's been such a demand for regional hotels, especially during lockdown. And no doubt you will have all had your experiences. I would imagine there's at least one out of this audience that has spent a night in a regional hotel that they otherwise may not have chosen this year, had it not been for COVID. And so the smaller hotels, I would say, funnily enough, are better off. The larger ones, it depends how they've structured themselves. A large number of these hotels have actually got into huge amounts of debt because they wanted to renovate. And so they put off the investments in technology, the investments in their infrastructure. You've got to remember a hotel should really renovate pretty much every 7 years. And if they're not changing their beds every 2 or 3, you've got to wonder how many people are sleeping on them. That doesn't mean to say that everybody does change their beds every 2 or 3 years, but the point being that there's a constant investment in the product. That's what keeps hotels surviving. And any hotel that's behaved properly and done their investments are probably going to find that it's quite a challenging time because they're unable to use the spare capital and don't perhaps have that much saved up. So for the larger regional hotels, I would imagine it's quite a challenge. For the smaller regional hotels, I would hazard a guess that it's manageable. I don't know if that's venturing too far, but I think that's a broad assessment.
Yeah, questions has come up with what sort of knock-on effects do you see from this into, you mentioned people entering the industry and that for young people in training, and historically Switzerland's had a huge reputation for its hotel training establishments. How do you see that working? I guess it's not going to be good news.
Well, I'm lucky enough to teach the BTS qualification at the EHTL school in Luxembourg. And funnily enough, it appears that there's more demand for students this year than there was last year, which I wouldn't have expected, but maybe that's because they're more available, or I don't know, it could be a whole host of reasons. I would say that there are a number of ways to look at this, but 2,000 years ago, Jesus was born in a crib or in a manger because there was no room at the inn. They talk about biblical industries, but hospitality has to be one. There was no inventory management in the hotel, and he was born outside. There's an element to say that hotels will invariably survive, maybe not in the guise that we know them today, and maybe not with the number of staff that we know today. But it's odd to think of a world where we would not travel for recreation. From Herodotus right up to the present day, people talk about travel. They talk about the impact of travel. They talk about cultural awareness, and it's very difficult to imagine any of that taking place over Zoom. So I would say that generally speaking, the hotel industry is going to be resilient, and there's no reason to believe that people won't want to go into it. Technology is definitely taking a major part of what was once considered a pretty lowly job, and making it something quite akin to, well, if you imagine a revenue manager, I've set the pace of Regi Hotels based on revenue management predominantly. Obviously, there's digital marketing and there are other elements, but it's the revenue management that has the most immediate impact. Revenue management is the concept, if we take the airline analogy once more, of somebody sitting to your left and somebody sitting to your right, and all three of you paid a different price based on when you bought your ticket, how you bought your ticket, whether it was part of a package or whether it was individual, and what length of journey you're having. So, for example, the person that flies from Luxembourg to I don't know, Luxembourg to Bangkok. Will they be sitting on the, with British Airways, will they be sitting on the same flight from Luxembourg to London Heathrow as someone who paid the same price as them or less because they're going further? Will the timing of when that ticket was purchased have an impact on the price? Well, yes, it will. And there are a great many other factors. Well, that analysis going into the intricacies of travel and why people travel and the supply and demand of travel make it that there are certain areas of the tourism industry that are opening up to an analysis that's almost akin to forecasting in the futures markets on the stock exchange, ultimately trending why people move. Yeah, sorry.
No, I think that's a very accurate comment. I mean, we saw how the unbundling of air travel effectively started with Ryanair, and how everybody's moved in that direction. One last question I think we've just got to pay a little attention to the time is that from Jeff, do you see the major chains going bankrupt? Will they try and ride it out? I mean, they're probably facing challenges. A lot of industries are facing similar challenges.
I'm no expert in the money markets, but I would have thought that, first of all, the majority of these companies, if you take Accor or Intercontinental, have gone for an asset light approach. So in fact, they don't really own their buildings. That's given over to other entities. Accor, funnily enough, actually was one of the largest property owners in Europe. Is that possible? And they created a separate company. One of them is called Accor Invest, and one of them is called Accor Services. Accor Services run the hotels under the names of Sofitel, Novotel, Mercure, and Accor Invest is the owner of the building for the large part. That's not the case here, but for the most part. I would say that the parts of the business that are affected or that are related to hotel ownership are probably going to struggle. But maybe it's anyone's guess. But I would have thought that if you have an asset-light strategy and that your model is based on a commission of the sales, 12% of the turnover or the like, then you're going to be less at risk if you're able to manipulate your employees and decrease your fixed costs by reducing and letting staff go, than if you also had to contend with empty buildings and presumably, hotels are very much like a country house. If you go to a country house once every 4 or 5 months, you may need to run the water in the taps for a few minutes before you start drinking it. You probably need to flush the loo a couple of times, and you might need to aerate the beds and let a little air into the room. A hotel is very similar. The dampness and all kinds of problems start to occur when a hotel hasn't been occupied. And it can go very quickly. Just one Christmas period is enough to get a hotel smelling pretty sterile if it's not being used. So I would say that a lot of attention needs to be given to those hotels that are going to reopen. But I wouldn't be able to argue or one way or the other as to the future viability of any of these larger companies. I'm afraid I simply don't know. Yeah.
Okay. I would like to close it there. Gregory, listen, thank you very much indeed for really stimulating presentation. The feedback I'm getting also on the chat is that people are extremely motivated and interested by the presentation. Thank you for taking your time to join us. And again, it's been really stimulating, and thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you so much for having the opportunity to speak. Yeah, it was a great privilege and pleasure to be here. And yeah, it's yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Now I'm going to close it now. Thank you very much.
Excellent.